Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Allison Carruth, Assistant Professor of English and a core faculty member in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Oregon. Carruth's interests lie in contemporary literature and new media, as well as environmental humanities and food politics. She writes and teaches about American literature, modernism, postmodernism, digital culture, and globalization. In her current research, Carruth considers how writers and artists respond to two central problems of the 20th and early 21st centuries: the sustainability of the food system and the ethics of genetic engineering. During the 2011 winter term, Carruth is teaching the class Environmental Humanities, Methods and Media, as well as organizing the Food Justice Conference, which will take place on the U of O campus February 19th through 21st. Allison, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you, Barbara.
We're really happy to talk to you about the conference before it takes place so that some of our many viewers might be able to come and take advantage of some of the things you're offering. You are a busy woman this term.
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with talking about the conference a little bit. First of all, what is food justice? Can you define the term?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And when we were designing and planning the conference over the summer, we had originally had a very long title for the event. It was Food Security and Food Sustainability. And we realized that those words are important, security and sustainability. The idea that we are bringing together scholars and policymakers and activists, as well as farmers and even chefs, who are all very invested in a food system that is secure economically, politically, but also one that has an ecological ethic and sustainable praxis at its core. But we wanted a kind of concept that would get at both the ecological and the human dimensions of the conference in a single word, and justice is the word we kept coming back to. And I think for most people, justice connotes maybe the legal system, maybe it connotes human ethics, social justice, and for some it connotes environmental justice. And we thought it would be interesting to build on the work of both scholars and activists who have started to use this term food justice to bring both the social and the ecological, the economic as well as the legal, all together into a sort of rubric for how we create a roadmap for the food system of our future. So that is the rationale behind food justice. And two scholars at Occidental College have actually just published a book with MIT Press using this same term.
Is that a coincidence, a happy coincidence?
It is a happy coincidence. They had already been working out this concept for some time in cooperation with some coalitions of farm worker advocacy groups and sustainable agriculture organizations in Southern California. But the book's publication is a happy coincidence.
Great timing for you.
Yeah.
And it sounds as though it's a term that's beginning to find its way into the discussion on these issues
I think so.
as a kind of shorthand for all the things you just mentioned.
Right. Yes.
It's an amazingly varied program. When I looked over what the program that's online already, I was struck by just the range of activities that are going to be happening. Can you talk about some of the highlights from your perspective?
Yes, I mean, I'll start with the plenary talks because we are really fortunate to have two renowned leaders in this area. The first is Vandana Shiva, who is going to be holding the Wayne Morse Chair at the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics this winter. And Shiva, some of your viewers may know her from her writing, others from her activism in India. She's written books like Earth Democracy and Seeds, Not Oil, among many others. And her interest is in building coalitions of farmers and food purveyors and other sort of social groups that are disenfranchised and left out of the current food system. And she has a particular focus on women and the role of women, both the current role and the potential role of women in making the food system one that is just and sustainable. And so in terms of our three conference themes, which are community, equity, and sustainability, we couldn't have a more ideal speaker than Shiva. And she has spoken in Oregon before, and some of your viewers maybe have heard her in other contexts. She spoke at Oregon State in a conference on women and justice. I think that's loosely what the theme was. And she has spoken at the public law conference that's held here annually. So in some ways it's a return for her to Oregon, but in a different context than before. So that's one of our plenary speakers. The other is a longtime U.S. farmer and organic farming as well as small farming advocate, Fred Kirschenman, who's a fellow at the Leopold Center at Iowa State. And he too is just a kind of leading light in this area. So we'll have both an American-centered plenary talk and a talk centered more on the developing world and the global south. So that we're very happy about that pairing. But other highlights include Derek Goldstein, who founded Gastronomica, really the first journal of its kind that has done this marvelous thing, which is provide a forum for some of the best scholarship in the humanities and social sciences on food and agriculture. But it's also a journal you'll find at your local co-op or Whole Foods grocery stores. So it has this broader resonance, and it's really through her leadership that that's been possible. And they're celebrating their 10th anniversary as of this fall, and so she'll be reflecting a bit on the journal's evolution. We have phenomenal scholars from the sciences as well as the social sciences who have been doing field work around genetically modified organisms. We have humanities scholars who are going to help us think about the long history of food and whether food justice is an appropriate concept for thinking about other periods, like the colonial period in the Caribbean, for example, or the history of chocolate trade between Europe and the New World, and some of the literary and artistic responses to that economic history. So that gives you some of the many highlights. There are more to talk about as we go on, probably.
I wanted to pick up on some of the ones that you mentioned in your two plenaries. It really is a wonderful pairing of speakers, I think. Vandana Shiva will be speaking towards the end of the conference,
That's
I think, right? She's kind of bringing things to a close. And I wanted to say about the blurb that you have on your website, which is a quotation from your other plenary speaker, Frederick Kirschenman. The term food justice started to make sense to me when I read this quotation from him, which is about principles of sustainability and the fact that they have to be actualized in a way that works for farms and farm families. So the justice involves also making this a sustainable practice for the producers who are putting our food on the table for us.
Go ahead.
No, that's it. Go ahead.
One of the terms that has become really important to the movement that some call the food change movement or food system change movement, and food justice is becoming one of its other monikers, is livelihood. How do we really transform our practices of both producing and consuming food so that we are investing in the livelihood of farmers and farm families at all scales and in different regional and national contexts? And I think that term livelihood is going to be an important one, particularly Fred Kirschenman's talk, but to other sessions as well.
What you said about Dara Goldstein's publication Gastronomica is, I think, relevant to your whole program. You laid out something that touches all of us in some ways, from the really academic, conceptual piece of this to the immediate, what are we doing here in Oregon? How do we help Oregon food producers?
Yes.
By the way, we're going to be interviewing Dara Goldstein as well. She agreed to do an interview with us, so that will be a great follow-up to our conversation. Another thing that I noted on the menu,
it is a kind of menu
on your conference menu, yes, is the staged reading of Salmon is Everything, a wonderful theater piece that Teresa May from Theater Arts here is doing in conjunction with the Klamath Theater Project. I know that she'll be doing this and producing it in a more fully staged version later this term, I believe.
In the spring.
Later this year. But you're going to get a staged reading to open the conference?
Yes, so there will be this sneak preview of this really marvelous play, and it's going to speak to some very regional issues around our river and ocean fisheries and some of the social histories and current social challenges that confront the indigenous communities of Oregon, as well as the state as a whole. Salmon is everything. That title seems to be really appropriate to the Pacific Northwest and to this marine life that has sort of co-evolved with us here and has a really rich story to tell. So I'm really thrilled that we're going to have this stage reading as a pre-conference event on Friday night, the 18th.
It's great that will help build an audience for it too, because it deserves as big an audience as they can possibly draw for it in the spring.
It does.
Another element I noticed was that you open actually before the staged reading of Salmon is Everything with a graduate student symposium. So it looks as though there's a significant graduate student presence.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because in addition to the symposium, which is going to take the shape of a kind of town hall so that the audience and the graduate students participating will have the opportunity to hear from a number of our University of Oregon graduate students, as well as some graduate students coming from elsewhere. There's just really marvelous research that these students are conducting right now. And in my view, it's really graduate students that are doing path-breaking work to develop whole new fields of study that really cross traditional disciplinary bounds. And many of these students are working in particular field research projects, for example, on fair trade in Mexico, and whether fair trade really is fulfilling its promises. So that's just one example. So the research that will be highlighted in the graduate symposium will probably be some of the best you're going to find on these topics. I mean, I'm just thrilled. But the other piece of that is that graduate students are so involved in the planning of this event, especially our graduate student coordinator of the conference, Lindsay Naylor, but many, many other graduate students beside who are volunteering their time to help with everything from the panel sessions to the art exhibition. So.
That is, of course, the perfect segue to allow me to ask you about the art exhibition. I'm really curious to know what's going to be on display. It's food, right? It's food.
Yes, food conceptually. I mean, this will be a space of the conference where we're going to have a little bit more playfulness and play with the term food, because some of our artists who are exhibiting work, it will be a more literal treatment of the topics of food and agriculture. And while others, it will be more conceptual, more thought pieces about what our relationship is to the edible world, sort of broadly described. And one, so for example, we have Douglas Gayeton and Baron Bixler, who are both photographers, doing different but I think complementary documentary projects. Douglas's project is the Lexicon of Sustainability, and he's essentially been photographing food and agriculture visionaries, farmers, chefs around the country who are trying on the ground every day in their own professional and kind of civilian lives, community lives, to develop new food systems. And so that set of photographs will be, I think, really evocative. And Baron Bixler's project is, by comparison, a documentary of a small fishing community in Brazil. So we have things like that on the one hand, and then we also have something like Natalie Jeremijenko's very experimental work called a cross-species adventure dinner club, which we will be kind of doing a video installation, giving people a sense of what these dinner adventure clubs are as they have taken shape in Brooklyn and elsewhere.
They actually happen?
These are events, right? These are events where meals are created around not foods that are our sort of usual ingredients in a gourmet restaurant, but rather foods that are taken from the local ecosystem that other species eat. So wild fungi, for example. And she builds around these a kind of ethical and performance art piece is the best way to describe it, I think.
I'm really glad you described that, because when I read the title,
it's
I thought, I was intrigued, yes. But
yeah.
It's really nice to see that there is a lighthearted, artistic, creative approach worked into all of this as well.
Yeah.
Just to specify, the food exhibit and all the artwork is at the Maud Kern Center, right?
It is at the Laverne Krauss, yes.
I beg your pardon, Laverne Krauss. Thank you for correcting me.
Laverne Krauss Gallery.
I'm glad we got that right. Okay, so in Laverne Krauss, thank you. Okay. Is this, the organizing of this conference, has it been one of your main activities as a fellow at the Wayne Morse Center this year?
It has, yeah, it certainly has. I mean, the fellowship has also provided me wonderful time to finish my book project, but my primary activity for the Wayne Morse Center has been the organizing of this conference, with the wonderful support of Margaret Halleck, the executive director of the center.
When Margaret told us about it and how closely it lines up with our sustenance theme for the year, we were really excited.
Well, and on that note, I have to thank the Humanities Center for your support of the conference. So
very happy to help. You spoke about your book manuscript. Could you talk about your own research a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I just completed a book that is entitled Global Appetites, Imagining the Power of Food. And in it, I consider a group of very different writers and to some extent visual artists who are grappling, beginning in the early 20th century, with what the industrialization of our food system really means for our relationships to the environment, but also for ideas of community and consumption both. And these writers range from someone like Willa Cather, who after World War I begins to really change her narratives of Nebraska to account for what are sort of new relationships between the relatively small farmers of the Plain States and a global economy that's kind of taking off after the First World War. So someone like that on the one hand, to the novelist Toni Morrison, who in the 80s writes a novel set in the Caribbean that for me is about the global politics of chocolate and other exotic foods like it. So that's just a kind of sampling. I think of it as a kind of literary and cultural history of the food system under globalization.
I think that description of the book might just have answered my next question, which was, how do you do a PhD in English literature and end up doing what you do? Was your description of using literature as a way to trace relationships to the production of food, is that part of the answer?
Yeah, it definitely is part of the answer. When I first was pursuing my graduate work, I became really interested in the particular ways that imaginative works, literature in particular, can show us how big global changes, in the technology, in this case of the food system, in the economics of the food system, in the legal apparatus that, comes with this new kind of food production, how all of that is also manifested in individual interpersonal ways of consuming and producing and inhabiting the natural world. So that seems to be something the arts can do in a way that other modes of inquiry or of representation can't.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah.
How do the arts do that in a unique way?
Yeah, so for example, I talk in one part of this book about Waiting for Godot, which is Samuel Beckett's famous play, and one other scholar has talked in depth about the issues of hunger and really taken seriously the presence of food and its dearth in that play, and put that in the context of the Irish potato famine. And so I kind of extend this to say, well, one of the other things that Beckett is showing us really dramatically is that after World War II, with famine and rationing persisting in Europe, there is this kind of state of starvation, that people, particularly in lower economic groups, are living with and living under. But he links that global dynamic to these interpersonal relationships between his famous characters, Vladimir and Estragon. And so to take something like famine or rationing, which a social scientist would approach importantly in terms of kind of macroeconomic structures or political frameworks that are either advancing or failing to alleviate famine, for example. A playwright like Beckett is able to show us emotional responses and effects, to show us how that changes someone's ability to kind of get on day by day as a really important concern in that play. How do we just get by with, for example, only carrots and turnips in our pockets? Does that begin to answer your question?
Yes, yeah, I think it does, and I think it's a really useful reminder that that this is a theme that crosses all kinds of disciplines, and you got there through a route that I don't know if it surprised you to end up where you've ended up, but any one of our particular disciplines can lead to the same notion.
Yeah, it's true, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I think for me, something like the food system really invites a huge range of approaches to understanding how we, make our food system work for communities and, and the environment as well.
Yeah. You mentioned big changes during and after World War I, and you mentioned the kind of the famine that was, or the culture of lack that was imposed upon the generation of World War II.
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the depiction of food after World War I?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's somewhat more well known that after World War II, and particularly during the Cold War, that there was this incredible transformation of agriculture, in part through the Green Revolution. We suddenly have these new chemicals and other inputs that we've never used before, and many biotech companies were involved in that shift. But less attention has been paid to these years between World War I and World War II that were also significant in terms of a similar transformation. In terms of a kind of technological history, something I really dwell on is the arrival of synthetic nitrogen, which happens on a mass scale after World War I, during and after World War I, as we start in the United States importing nitrates from Chile and elsewhere into American farms as a way to speed up the productivity. But in terms of an even bigger story that I'm interested in, it's in those years where the United States starts to imagine food and imagine its farmland as really the key to global power, to economic and political power both. And you see that manifest not only in war posters, for example, one that depicts food as ammunition and literally shows food transformed into bombs, to the literature of the period as well, where writers are starting to key into this power of food to kind of advance the United States into a position of global hegemony.
You mentioned Eudora Welty as one of the people you study from that point of view, right?
Yeah.
Are there other authors who leap to mind?
Yes. So I have written about both writers who were writing at the time and writers who write retrospectively about those years, including Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, M.F.K. Fisher, who is a brilliant food writer of the mid-century, who is also very aware and very insightful about this relationship to how we eat around a kitchen table or in a restaurant, and what are the sort of larger economic and political factors or forces that make that meal possible. And so she's someone I write about at great length, in fact. Lorene Nidecker is one final writer I'd mention, who's a fascinating poet of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, who's similarly invested in these kinds of issues in her poetry.
I don't know Nidecker at all, but of course M.F.K. Fisher is known to anybody who's a foodie.
That's right.
Right, and Welty, of course, is such a hero in the American literary landscape as a regional writer.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that once again you're finding the common thread that you can extract from those people who are known for other things.
Right.
Allison, you're teaching a class on environmental humanities right now. It's a graduate level class, right?
Yeah.
And are those some of the GTFs who are participating in the conference?
There are some of the students in that class who are participating in the conference, indeed, as well as in an environmental studies colloquium I'm teaching alongside it.
So how are you leading them to problematize and think through the notion of the conjunction between the humanities and environmentalism?
Yeah.
Big question.
It's a big question. It's a good question. The course aims to really ask the question of what the humanities has to offer our current environmental crisis. You know, what kinds of modes of inquiry and analysis, what kinds of ethical positions and ethical insights the humanities brings. And one way that we're approaching that question is by putting very diverse kinds of artistic materials together into conversation, including a novel by the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh, who writes really beautifully and in a nuanced way about climate change and its effect on the human and non-human population of Bangladesh and of southern India. So that's sort of one example. On the other extreme, we're looking at art-science collaborations that are taking place in the Arctic around climate change that include teams of multimedia artists, climate scientists, web and computer designers, and the results of that can be explored on sites like the Canary Project and Cape Farewell. So the aim of this class is to ask them to think about what are the methods of scientific inquiry, what are the methods of humanistic inquiry, and how do we forge new kinds of collaborations among those as we seek to answer questions like what is climate change and what does it signify for different communities around the world, and what are different ways of imagining alternative futures than, let's say, the most apocalyptic scenario. So that probably gives you an example from one unit. We're also looking at things like high-tech trash, so trying to understand how artists are who work in multiple media and work with information media are also thematizing the great amount of waste that our sort of technology age is simultaneously producing.
I was very curious about the incorporation of the media explicitly into this material. That's obviously a piece that you yourself use very effectively. You blog, you do things using all the new digital technologies.
Yeah.
And I suppose if this is actually an emerging field,
right.
we need to be training those graduate students to make use of all of the the dissemination mechanisms and communication mechanisms open to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't put it better myself.
I know you're only in week 2 of this course,
Yeah.
these courses at the moment, so there's much more time for all of this to develop. But any other current projects going on, or what you're hoping to get to?
Yeah, this new class relates to a second book project that I'm calling BioArt, which is about a group of artists and writers and product engineers and scientists who are collaborating in very interesting ways around imagining sustainable futures for us, and sometimes in very experimental terms. And so that's the new work, and it includes everything from the novelist Richard Powers, who packs his novels with sort of the latest in scientific thinking about the natural world and our relationship to it, to the architectural group in Brooklyn called Terraform One, that's designing speculative cities of the future that will combine both genetically engineered tissues as building materials and sort of state-of-the-art ways of recycling waste and water and producing food, and the list sort of goes on from there.
How do you find that material? You must spend a lot of time just poking around on the web looking to see what other people are doing.
I think it's doing things like this Food Justice Conference, and also being really involved in both within the Academy and outside of it in a kind of, very vibrant and sort of eclectic group of scholars and activists and thinkers and writers who are sort of trying to figure out, where we go from here, I guess.
So the more network you can stay, the better, because things will come to your attention.
It seems like that's what tends to happen. Yeah, it's one of the great things about the digital age, in fact.
Yeah, it's very exciting what you're doing, and I just want to make sure we get the dates out there again. So the conference is called Food Justice. It starts on Friday, February the 18th, and it runs through the 21st, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. It's been really great to have you here.
Barbara.
Thank you for taking the time to come and tell us about it.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
And I'll be there, and with great pleasure, I'm sure.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Allison Carruth, Assistant Professor of English and a core faculty member in the Environmental Studies program at the U of O. She is the primary organizer of the Food Justice Conference, which will take place on campus February 19th through 21st. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.